Good evening. I find it very interesting that different generations are kind of like different cultures sometimes. and it's actually really true. This past weekend, my grandma came to stay with me and Emily. She's actually still here tonight. Go over to where we're sitting after we're done. Introduce yourself. Her name's Brenda Knight. She loves to meet new people. But while Grandma was over this weekend, she was reading a post on Facebook that was talking about things from her generation. Things like I think it's called a rotary phone, in which you have to put your finger in and spin it around in order to dial. Things like putting foil on TV antennas in order to get a better signal, which I thought your signal came from your cell phone. It's interesting when we start to look at different generations and see differences. We also see what's important to different generations. What's important to one generation may not be as important to another generation. What's important to my parents' generation may be different than what's important to my generation. Things that seem like it would be very vital for a society to function. Things like punctuation. I'm serious. Did y'all know that if you end a text with a period, it seems like you're giving someone attitude? It's real. You can ask your children, or you can ask your grandchildren, anybody in high school, they'll tell you that if you're sending a text and you text like 3 sentences in a row and end every single one of them with a period, you're mad about something. Whereas if you texted 3 sentences in a row and ended them all on exclamation points, you're not yelling at anybody, you're excited. It's interesting when we look at the differences we have as people. We have these differences between male and female as well. Tonight, after y'all go home and you're on your way home tonight, the men are probably going to be thinking about how many times did Dylan mention football in tonight's lesson. The ladies are going to be contemplating whether or not the sweater and tie actually match, because those are things that are important to each one of us. Those are things that will stay on our minds, things that we think about. And our differences are what make us us. People will see a story or will hear about a story, and certain things will stick in certain people's minds. Different things stick out to different people based on your background, based on what makes you you. I've heard the phrase that the perception is reality to the perceiver. The person who sees things, who perceives things, that becomes their reality. That's what they understand to be true. We see the same thing in the gospel accounts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each one different people. Each one his own person. Records things slightly differently. Does that mean they're wrong just because there's differences? Of course not. We'll get into that here in a minute. But each one of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, record the story of Jesus, the account of Jesus, and each one is just slightly different. I want to look at tonight real quick, though, at the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is not included in the Synoptic Gospels because his is enough different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are nearly identical. They're very, very similar Gospels in the way that the accounts are recorded, the order of how things are recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But the reason they're called synoptic is because it's a word that comes from being seen together or being parallel to one another, because they are so similar. When you really lay out Matthew, Mark, and Luke right beside each other, they are very, very similar accounts of the story of Christ. But those small differences that they have, even though they are very, very similar, each one has slight differences. Those small differences are really evidence for the reliability of those eyewitness accounts that Matthew, Mark, and Luke recorded. Atheists will look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and even John and say, look at how many differences there are. Look at these contradictions between Matthew and Mark. How can you not see that? That there is a difference here, that they're disagreeing with one another. How can you trust what is being said? There was a man, though, by the name of J. Warner Wallace, actually a detective, a renowned detective, that he was known across the country as a man that could solve any cold case. A cold case being one that the trail had gone cold. There are no new clues being discovered. There's nothing, no other stones to be overturned to figure out anything else with the case. And so the case had gone cold. But Detective Wallace would come in and he would look at the evidence. He would interview the eyewitnesses again, and he would piece these puzzles together and come to a solution. Detective Wallace, though, was an atheist. And so, as an atheist, he set out to try to prove the Bible wrong. So he decided the best place to start, if he's going to prove the Bible wrong, would be to start with the gospel accounts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Because he knew they had some differences. But as he started to study them and look deeper and deeper in them, he realized that they looked to him as more like eyewitness accounts the more and more that he read them. You see, as a professional detective, he's quoted with saying, if you've ever worked with eyewitnesses, you know one rule of witnesses: they never, ever agree. Not that they don't agree on the point of what's being said, the point of what's being taught about Jesus Christ. But it's the little details that matter to you, the little details that matter to you, the little details that matter to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's what makes the Synoptic Gospels great. I want to look at one story tonight, though. Looking at all of the accounts that are recorded of this story, of Matthew and Mark and in Luke, and it's the passage that Steve just read for us, where Jesus is giving his disciples instructions on what we are to do if we want to follow him. So let's start in Matthew. It's in Matthew 16 where we're going to be starting tonight. We'll start with Matthew's account here. And it's immediately following Peter's confession of Christ. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, Peter confesses, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father." Immediately following that, though, Jesus starts to predict his death. Peter's confessed Christ, and Jesus says, "You got it. Good job. You know that I am the Son of God." And so Jesus then tells them, this is what I must do. This is what I've been sent to this earth for, is to give up my life, to sacrifice myself, to make atonement for all of you. Peter is shocked by this, and he says, not a chance. There's no way this could happen. There's no way the Son of God, the man that I just confessed and he confirmed it, is going to die. You see, Peter's understanding is still in a earthly reign. Peter's understanding is that the Messiah was to come and overthrow Rome. This big, bad empire, this Roman occupation. That's what Peter's understanding of the Messiah was. And so when Jesus tells him that, no, I'm going to give up my life, Peter says there's not a chance that happens. Jesus replies to him, "Get behind me, Satan," and then continues into verse 24 and following of Matthew chapter 16. So follow along with me as we read this. Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 24. Then Jesus told his disciples, after he tells Peter to get behind him, this is the instruction: "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Jesus begins it with a choice. Peter has said, there's no way that you're going away. I know you're the Son of God, but there's no way you're going away. And Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow me, it's your choice. Nobody is being forced into this. Nobody is being caused to follow Christ. But if you do choose, if you would, you have to deny yourself. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself. You know, when we talk about this denying of ourselves, sometimes we get into the martyr complex, as it's called. The thinking that I have to completely remove anything from my life that will bring me even the slightest bit of pleasure. I believe it was a few months ago when Myron was preaching, talking about something similar to this and saying that there are people who believe they can't even taste ice cream because that will bring them just the slightest bit of pleasure. That's what I like to call the martyr complex. It's not a matter of removing anything from your life that brings you any sort of pleasure, but rather it's the letting go of self-determination. Letting go of the desires for riches, the desires for fame. It's a matter of letting go for the desires of wanting to be served rather than serving. It's a matter of letting go of the desires of wanting to be honored, wanting to be in the place of honor. To deny yourself is to let go of the idea that I have to be number one. Jesus says, if you want to follow me, if you would, you must deny yourself. You must lose sight of or renounce your own desires. But he doesn't just leave it at that. He continues on to say, and take up his cross. You know, when we hear that phrase, take up your cross, a lot of times we think of that's going to be the burdens that I bear. I'm going to take up my cross. I'm going to have this burden that I bear. We have this phrase that is used, well, I guess this is just my cross to bear. That's not the context Jesus is talking about. When you deny yourself, you have to fill that void with something. You fill that void by taking up your cross, letting go of your own desires, renouncing to put off your own desires, and instead pick up your cross, pick up the will of God that he has for your life, pick up the desires of God. That's what Jesus did when he took up his cross. Philippians chapter 2, towards the end of that chapter, is talking about the humility that Christ has. That he humbled himself, specifically in verse 8. It says that he humbled himself even to the point of death. Death on a cross. Jesus says, if anyone is going to come after me, you must deny yourself. Put off whatever wants and desires that you want for this life. And instead, humble yourself enough to take up your cross, take up the will that God has for your life. When we understand it in that way, we realize Jesus talked about this a lot. You know, he talked all the time about not wanting to be the greatest, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. He said that the Son of Man has not come to serve, but to be served. He said to the rich young ruler that you have to sell all that you have, not because money is evil, but because the love of money is. So that's Matthew's account. He finishes by saying, for what are you going to gain if you lose the whole world or if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? So why not deny yourself and take up your cross? He says in verse 26, or verse 25 first, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Continuing in verse 26, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? What shall a man give in return for his soul? Why not deny yourself and take up your cross? Why not renounce your own desires? It doesn't gain you anything in the long run. It says in verse 27, "For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then repay each person according to what he has done." We each have the choice of what response we're going to make to this. And Jesus is going to repay our deeds when he comes back. I want to look now at Mark's account, though. Mark is very similar to Matthew in that he lays out all of this succinctly. If you will, turn over to Mark chapter 8. That's where we find Mark's account of this story. Towards the end of Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 34 and going through verse 38, he says the exact same thing. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." But the difference here, not saying that Matthew was wrong, not saying that Mark was wrong, but the subtle difference, the thing that stuck out to Mark as he's recording this was verse 38. He says, "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of the Father with the holy angels." Similar to what Matthew said at the end, but seems to carry much more weight, doesn't it? When we think about that word ashamed, it actually makes my mind go to Romans 1:16, when Paul confesses, I am not ashamed of the gospel. So I ask the question, what are we ashamed of? Surely we're not ashamed of the good news. Everyone here who has put on Christ in baptism has confessed that they believe that Jesus is the Son of God. They believe that news is real. Surely we're not ashamed of the good news. Perhaps we're ashamed of teaching the good news. Perhaps we're ashamed of teaching obedience to the good news. And that's a big difference right there. Because here in America, majority of people that you will come into contact with believe the good news. They're the same as you, and they believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. This is called a Christian nation for good reason, because majority of the people that you interact with also believe that Jesus came to this earth to give him of himself for you. But the difference lies in obedience. And so I ask the question tonight, with verse 38 of Mark chapter 8 in mind, are we ashamed of the words of Christ to have obedience to the good news? Are we ashamed to teach people that there is more than just believing in the good news? Are we ashamed to teach people that they must obey that good news? Now, while you're all answering in your own mind, I want to give a little, not a skit, but an example for you. How many times have you been studying with somebody, or how many times have you been having a conversation where it's like, well, yeah, I guess that you're supposed to be baptized. It's like, that's kind of the conclusion we've come to, I guess. Instead of confidently saying that, yes, I agree with Jesus. Yes, I believe that these words say you must obey the good news. I believe that these words, the words of God, say that you must put on Christ in baptism. Going further from there, though, how many of us are ashamed of condemning sin? When Jesus says, "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words," Jesus' words condemned sin. Are we ashamed to do the same? Because it's not popular. It's not an enjoyable thing to confront sin or to condemn sin. What about ourselves? How many of us are ashamed to admit fault. When Jesus said, "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words," Jesus' words were that you've sinned. That's why I'm coming to give myself up. If we are to say, "I have not, no, I've lived good, I've lived perfect." First John chapter 1, verses 9 and 10 record the exact same conversation. If you say that you have no sin, you make him out to be a liar. Turn with me there real quick to 1 John chapter 1. 1 John chapter 1, starting in verse 9, context is talking about walking in the light. In verse 9, it says, "If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness." In verse 10, though, "If we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us." Because that's the reason God sent Jesus to this earth, is because he knows that we have sinned. So when we stand up and are ashamed to admit fault, we're ashamed of the words that Jesus is saying, that I have come here for you. Luke takes it one more step further. Luke chapter 9, if you'll flip over there with me, this is the last place we'll go tonight. It's the same account that Matthew and Mark record, that if anyone would, it's starting in verse 57 going through the end of the chapter. Starting in verse 23 and going through the end of the chapter of Luke chapter 9. He records the same thing. If anyone would, it's your choice whether or not you want to follow Jesus. Let him deny himself. You must renounce all of your own desires, all of your own wants. You have to put that off and instead pick up your cross. Put off your own desires, pick up God's desires. There's a switch that's going on here. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three record this. Luke takes it one more step further, though. That we have to take up our cross daily. Matthew doesn't record that little word. Mark doesn't record that one word either. Does that make Luke wrong? Of course not. That's what stuck out to him. It's that if you're going to follow Jesus, this is a decision that must be made every single day of your life. You don't get a day off from being a Christian. I find it interesting that in a culture that enjoys vacations from work, enjoys our weekends, enjoys our time off, we don't talk about this more. I think it's because we also enjoy taking a break from being a Christian sometimes. Whenever you confessed Christ and put him on in baptism and were clothed with Christ, that was the first day you made that decision, not the only day. It's a decision that must be made every day of your life, for the remainder of your life. But I want to remind you, Jesus' own words, if you would. Nobody's forcing you. Teens, your parents aren't forcing you. They may have forced you to come here tonight, but they're not forcing you. Husbands and wives, your spouses aren't forcing you. Is it the right thing to do? I hope you've seen tonight, absolutely it is. But it's your choice whether or not you want to take up your cross every single day. Are we going to fall short? Of course. Are we going to make mistakes and live and fall into sin? Of course. Nobody is sinless. But again, as Myron pointed out this morning, there's a difference between being faithful and sinless. Tonight, that's what the invitation is for. And if it's not an invitation that you make publicly here in front of the entire congregation, if instead it's an invitation that you respond to your friends, respond to your family, or even better yet, respond to one of our elders, I know that there's nothing they would rather do than to talk with you about how to make this choice every day. Whatever your need is, I encourage you to come forward as we stand and sing.